Live on YouTube. Why are you putting this on YouTube?
Because Erica having connection issues, so if I can pull it up on YouTube, she
Oh, okay. Where are you looking at, man? We're going live. So if both the state and Congress occupies the field, it's okay if the state regulation is more restrictive or more rigorous than Congress's. Does that make sense?
mm-hmm.
And then the last one is intergovernmental immunity requires that states may not tax or regulate federal government activity, which I love this one because this means if the federal government wants to come into a state and do something that normal people would be taxed for by the state, because it's the federal government doing it, they can't be taxed the state tax. So yeah, that's that. The dormant comma clause. The dormant comma clause is a pretty interesting one because remember how I said with the Commerce Clause, nobody can regulate it or do anything except Congress. But the dormant comma clause allows the state to regulate interstate commerce, but it looks at the effects on it. So if the state passes a law that will discriminate commerce, unduly burden interstate commerce, then they have to have a rational relationship to advance legitimate state interests. So an example would be, let me think, what's a good example? Oh, a good example is the firearm law in California. How you can't like, I think he was telling me, you can't purchase like a full firearm or pieces or something of that nature. But the federal government just ruled that you can because all the pieces are through interstate commerce. So that what California was doing caused a burden to interstate commerce, not allowing people to purchase certain things, a firearm or pieces or something of that nature. But the federal government just ruled that you can because all the. How can I hear myself?
Because I had to put it on another phone to get the link so I can send it out.
Interstate commerce.
Okay, go ahead.
No, don't do that, please. Okay, please don't do that. Come on. You're asking enough, baby. There you go. Good point. So, yeah, so the dormant comma clause, if it does discriminate, you have to use strict scrutiny. And strict scrutiny is there has to be a compelling state interest. So, actually, a better example is plastic bottles. Plastic bottles are something that goes through interstate commerce. So, if California does a regulation says that no manufacturer could use plastic bottles to do their soda pops or their container, like nothing, they can't use plastic for anything, then California will need to show, well, what's your compelling state reason? Oh, because the plastic bottles end up in the ocean causing pollution. Okay, well, is it narrowly tailored? Narrowly tailored just means that is this restrictive or restriction the only like the, I can't even describe narrowly tailored. How did he describe it? Yeah, so is it narrowly tailored to fit or to benefit or to reach that compelling state interest of fixing the pollution problem in California? And the third is least restrictive, which means that there's no other way you can do this. Like, this is the only way to ban all types of plastic bottles coming in and out of California. So that's the the narrowly tailored, the strict scrutiny. Anything that discriminates has to meet strict scrutiny. So if it says that out-of-state people, no, I'm using the wrong examples for these. We're going to come back to dormant commerce clause. I'm using the wrong examples. Sorry.
That's okay. Just read the definition or whatever it is again, then give me a right example.
Okay, so another one is if it benefits is how you determine if what a state regulation is a benefit. It is the benefit burden balancing test. If the regulation is to benefit a state interest, the benefit of the state has to outweigh the burden placed on the plaintiff. Does that make okay? No, that doesn't make sense. I'm going to explain it to you. So if the regulation in California says no plastic bottles and your manufacturer is like, that's going to place an economic burden on me, does the benefit of trying to decrease the amount of pollution from plastic bottles that end up in the ocean, does that benefit outweigh the burden of the amount of money that this manufacturer of soda pop is going to have to change and alter his containering for all his soda and juice products? That's the benefit burden balance that they have to look at. And then rational relationship is a reasonable relationship between a statute and a legitimate government interest. So the statute of not using plastic bottles, the legitimate government interest, we're trying to control the pollution in the ocean to save the whales or whatever. Like, does that statute directly is in relationship with the governmental objective? Yes, it does in that example. So therefore, California, even though it does burden interstate commerce, there's a benefit that outweighs the burden on the manufacturers, and that relationship between what they're trying to accomplish, as in making sure all these plastics don't end up in the Pacific Ocean, it's rationally related. So that's that. An exception that allows states to burden interstate commerce is if they're a market participator, which simply means, that's Poppy, which simply means if, for example, there was a waste case, the state owned a waste landfill and they owned it and operated it. So they say anybody from different states trying to bring their waste to our wasteland, they have to pay a tax, but in-state people don't have to pay this tax. The plaintiff was like, that's a discrimination of interstate commerce because they're treating in-state people who bring waste different from out-of-state people who bring waste. But because the state was a market participant, they were the owners of that landfill, then therefore it's okay. It's an exception. They get it passed to tax people differently from out of state to interstate. The privileges and immunity clause that requires that citizens of each state shall be entitled to all privileges and immunities of all states. Only the citizens are protected, corporations are not. This means if you, Monica, decide you want to move to Texas or anywhere, and Texas law says you have to be a resident of Texas for 1.5 years before you could receive any welfare benefits or any food stamps or anything like that, that's a violation of the privileges and immunity clause, because that's, because people who's been living there all their life get it just like that, but you moving from a different state, they're looking at it from like interstate travel, not the foreign country type stuff. Next we're going to look at some individual liberties, and I'm going to talk about it in a way that how I would write it on the exam. So when individual liberties are violated in any way, first you look at to see who's the actor. If it's Congress, the Fifth Amendment applies. If it's a state, the 14th Amendment applies through the incorporation doctrine that allows states to uphold or to apply the Bill of Rights to the states. It's through the incorporation doctrine of the 14th Amendment, the due process clause. First, for anybody to say this entity or this Congress or this government thing violated my individual liberties, it has to be a state action. State action requires the action to be taken by a government or an agent of the government. So if you try to go get some housing from a private person and they say, oh, I don't rent to Black people, or I don't rent to same-sex people, yes, that's a discrimination. However, the actor is not a government, is not the government, nor are they acting in the as an agent of the government. So you wouldn't have any type of standing, any type of action against that private person. However, if you sue that private person for discrimination and a state court rules against you, now you have a state action because there's a state court that ruled against you in a discrimination thing. So now that gives rise to the state action because the state court ruled in favor of the defendant that you were trying to sue. So there's 3 different levels of scrutiny that applies, and it depends on the liberty that's being violated. So the first one is rational basis. That requires the regulation is rationally related to a legitimate government purpose. And here the burden of proof is on the challenger. So if you're challenging California, Monica, for something, saying that this is not right or something, and hold on one second. Yeah, so the rational basis just requires that the regulation that is being put out there has to be rationally related to a legitimate government purpose. The next one is intermediate scrutiny, which requires that the regulation is substantially related to an important government purpose. And this is on the government to show that their regulation is substantially related to an important government purpose. And then the third one is strict scrutiny, which is the regulation is necessary. Bring that to mommy. That regulation is necessary to achieve a compelling. So the difference between all 3 of these, rational basis, it has to be rationally related to a legitimate government purpose. Intermediate, substantially related, and the purpose of the government is important only. And strict scrutiny, thank you. Strict scrutiny has to be necessary. The regulation this is the only necessary way to achieve the compelling purpose of the government. And the last 2, the burden of proof is on the government to show how that regulation is necessary or substantially related to achieve whatever it is that they're trying to do. Due process is covered by the 5th and 14th Amendment. There are 2 types of due process. The first one is procedural, requires notice and a proper opportunity to be heard, meaning that if you work for the government or if you get sued or property, life, liberty, or property right is taken away from you, you have a right to receive notice on that and the opportunity to be heard. That's just your day in court to be able to do that. There are 3 different types of due process rights. That's life, liberty, or property. And so liberty requires a loss of significant freedom provided by the Constitution. Property requires an entitlement that is not fulfilled. And if there's any loss of life, liberty, or property, the court must balance the importance of the interests of the individual, the ability of an additional procedures to increase the accuracy of the fact finding, and the government interest. The second one is substantive due process, which requires the government must have an adequate reason for taking away a person's life, liberty, or property. Wait, Lonnie, cutting out. For the 5th Amendment, it has to do with the government taking someone's property. It's called the taking clause, and that requires the government may take private property for public use if it provides just compensation, meaning that if you owned a piece of land and the government wanted to take it for whatever public use that they say is for, they can do it as long as they provide just compensation. There are 2 different types of takings. Possessory taking or physical taking requires the government to actually physically occupy your property, take it away from you. A regulatory taking requires the government regulation that leaves no reasonable economic values for the property. So like zoning, people have sued a lot for zoning ordinance and things like that because that's like a regulatory taking. But they use it as like, it's called the bundle of sticks method. If you drop the sticks and the owner still has a whole bunch of sticks, then they're fine. You like the economic value of their property has not been decreased, or taken in a substantial way. Sorry, 1 second. Hey, what are you doing? Don't do that, little girl. Get out of Daddy's wallet, man. I don't need to stop here like this. Okay. So if the government does take somebody's property, it has to be for public use. The government can't take your property and give it to a private corporation because that's gonna be, it's not gonna benefit the public. Therefore, if it's not benefiting the public, they can't take it. If they do take it and you don't have enough sticks left after you drop the bundle of sticks for the owner, then they have to pay just compensation, meaning they have to give
Are you talking about eminent domain or is that something else?
Eminent domain is similar to that, but yeah, that's real property. But it's
Okay.
definitely similar because that talks about the Fifth Amendment too. But yeah, it's just pretty much if they do say, okay, we're going to take your property for a playground or a school or whatever the case may be, a public use, they have to give you fair market value for that property. Next, we're going to talk about fundamental rights. Anything fundamental rights requires strict scrutiny. Here, take the chip. Don't mess it up. So strict scrutiny, remember, it has to be, requires regulation is necessary to achieve a compelling government purpose, and the burden of proof is on the government to show that it's necessary, meaning that it's narrowly tailored and least restrictive, meaning this is the best way, the only way to accomplish our compelling government interest. So there's a couple of fundamental rights. Right to privacy, that's marriage, procreation, abortion, conception, custody of children, raising of children, family, keep family together, engage private consensual homosexual activity, and refuse medical treatment. All those are classified under the right to privacy. Abortion, they apply a different test other than a strict scrutiny test. It's the undue burden test. So this, if a state regulation passes a regulation for abortion where it causes an undue burden for that woman to get an abortion, then it's going to be deemed a violation of her right to privacy, one of her fundamental rights. The second one, a fundamental right, is the right to domestic travel. That requires rational basis. So like for a while, like the COVID, everybody had to stay home, nobody could do anything. That was like that was a fundamental restriction on our right. But the rational basis of that was we're trying to, it's a widespread disease. They're trying their best to decrease the amount of that spread. So they had a rational basis to, rational basis in order to do that. Second Amendment, right to bear arms, right to do that. Like you have a fundamental right to have a gun. You have a fundamental right to vote. So the right to vote requires laws denying citizens the right to vote must meet strict scrutiny. So if you say a registered domestic alien cannot vote, you have to show why that is necessary why that's necessary to what's your compelling government interest for that regulation to be necessary. Like, what are you trying
So like the voting laws in Georgia that passed, that's making it harder for people to vote. They had just whatever, like they showed the restrictive Like, was it successful? Like, because they passed it, right?
They passed it in the state. However, the voters have standing to issue a Supreme Court, to go to the United States Supreme Court, because that's a violation of people's fundamental rights to vote. And that is where that state will have to show and prove whatever compelling government purpose that they're trying to do with that regulation. So the state court is not going to be able to do that, because this is a constitutional fundamental right. Okay, and then things that do not fall under fundamental rights, education. I know people like, I have a fundamental right to learn and to be accepted to the school. Not necessarily. Like, if you don't get into, for example, remember the girl from Texas who sued, I think it was a Texas university, because she said that affirmative action caused her spot to be taken by a bunch of Black people, even though she just didn't have the SAT scores or the GPA to get into the school. She filed under a constitutional basis, and that wasn't upheld. Practice to trade or profession. So as far as employment, there is no fundamental right to employment. If you get fired, you can't say, hey, that's my property right. No, because it's at will employment. The next major topic is equal protection. So we're looking at discrimination. Equal protection requires two groups of people who are similarly situated, but being treated differently. So there are classifications. The classifications will tell you which type of scrutiny to apply. So the first classification is apply strict scrutiny. And these ones are just very obvious. Race, national origin, alienation, and voting, and traveling domestically or whatnot. Those are strict scrutiny. And they have to have a necessary, show that the regulation is necessary to achieve a compelling purpose. So with race, there was a really big discussion in my class regarding this. Why isn't homosexuals a part of they're called the suspect class? And the only reason is because when you look at race, national origin, and alienage, those are, you can physically see that. So you're being discriminated based off of your outer appearance. So the example that I provide in class is like, it makes sense why race and why other things will not be a part of the suspect class, because Black people wake up every day and we're Black. Like, we don't have a choice off of how we wake up. However, some people who are homosexuals, you wouldn't tell them left or right unless they verbalize, hey, this is what I'm doing, or this is like my choice, or whatever, like this is my activity. So that's why I believe that they have the classes, even though that's not relevant to the topic. That's just, race is, of course, the number one reason. So a good example of that would be, you're trying to hire somebody, and not hire somebody. Like, yeah, there's a company that only hires Black or white carpenters, but then there's Black, Mexican, Asian carpenters. They're both carpenters, so that means they're similarly situated, but they're being treated differently because they have the same skill, the same thing, but they're being treated differently because they're of their race or their alienage or something like that. The next set of classifications are intermediate scrutiny. So the regulation just has to be substantially related to an important government interest. Once again, the burden of proof is on the government. So that's illegitimacy, gender, children of undocumented aliens. Illegitimacy is just children born out of wedlock. Anything that's gender-based discrimination, and children of undocumented aliens, which is pretty self-explanatory. And everything else that's not already mentioned just needs to meet the rational basis test. So if you're being discriminated based off of wealth, disability, age, something of that nature, The state just needs to show why the regulation is rationally related to their purpose. And the plaintiff is the burden of proof is on whoever bought the action to show that it is not rationally related. Hey, baby. All right. So there's two different types of discrimination. There's de facto discrimination, de jure. De facto discrimination is segregation that is not purposeful, but the regulation has a discriminatory impact and effect on, and the state needs a rational basis for the legislation. So there was a case in San Francisco dealing with dry cleaners. And I don't know if it was the Chinese or the Korean, but San Francisco or the state or a governmental entity had passed a regulation that impacted dry cleaners that were owned by people of Asian descent. And that one was actually ruled as a de jure discrimination because it was done solely for that reason, to impact those dry cleaners owned by people of the Asian descent. De facto is when you pass a regulation and on its face, it doesn't look discriminatory, but once it's applied, you start seeing the discriminatory effect of it. Does that make sense? Okay, good. So yeah, de jure discrimination is on its face and discriminatory in application and its motive. So that regulation, the motive of that regulation being passed is for a discriminatory reason. De facto is, hey, we're just passing this regulation and whatever the outcome of it is really going to determine if it's discrimination or not. Next, the First Amendment. You're looking at free speech. Speech, everybody's like, I can say whatever I want, that's what everybody say. However, we really can't say whatever we want, and everything is not protected speech. So some things of unprotected speech are enticements of illegal activity. That is like when you're saying something or doing something that is going to cause some type of immediate uproar or cause illegality in any way. That's not protected speech. Even if it's just conduct, like you have a lot of the Black Lives Matter movements when cops show up to them, and even though they're not saying anything, like their presence and that alone is likely to cause or entice, illegal activity or something like that. Even though this hasn't ever went to the Supreme Court, I do foresee something like that going to the Supreme Court as far as cops showing up to peaceful protests, which will likely result in rubber bullets, tear gas, and all that stuff. Unlike when you see people with full-blown firearms walking down the street and the cops don't even show up for stuff like that. It just is what it is. So that type of speech, anything that's going to entice criminal activity, is not protected. Obscene and sexual-oriented speech is not protected. However, to determine what is obscene, there's a three-part test. You take what the issue is. So if somebody's suing for, they don't want adult theaters in a certain part because it's inappropriate, they take what's being shown, what they're trying to rule out in a way, and they look at it from a local point of view, the state obscenity definition, and then the national standard of it. It's called the Miller test. And that's the Miller test. So if the material must appeal to a pertinent interest, so locally, the material must be patently offensive under the law prohibiting obscenity. So whatever the state regulation law is of obscenity, it is. And then they look at it as nationally. So if the material lacks serious, redeeming, artistic, literary, political, or scientific value,